So, philosophers.
Fauxlosophers. So this will be episode 4 in our 4-part series on Christianity. And some things that we say today might rely on things we've said in the previous episodes. So if you haven't caught up so far, you probably should.
Well, as most things that we tend to say in episodes, we've been trying to build a base, and with the exception of maybe our Boundaries of Privacy video, most of all of the videos we've done so far have been building up. And we really appreciate everybody who's actually been interested in those things before we've gotten to the meat of something. But this is no different. And then this one specifically builds on the previous 3, which is why it's in a series with them. And so if anything here feels out of context, we would highly encourage you to go back and, if you so choose, gather some context. We're not trying to hide anything, and we're not trying to skirt the bushes on anything here. So if anything seems like it's a little out of place or it doesn't make sense, and like you feel there may be some context there, please, if you so choose and are so intrigued, take a look at what we've done in the last 3 videos specifically.
So this week we're talking about coping with the unknown. This is a direct reference back to our first entry in the series, in which we talked about how religions, including Christianity, are submitted as explanations for phenomena that are hard to explain. And so the first thing that I'd like to get into is why we seek explanations for certain things. You know, for instance, God is given as an explanation for the universe or life, or pick whatever. Normally those 2. And the reason why we feel compelled to explain these things with a God, as opposed to trying to seek out some other explanation, is that they seem too complex to explain. That there is so much complexity to them that we feel the need to have an explanation for them, but they are so difficult to explain that rather than seeking one out genuinely, we come up with an explanation like a God.
Which, to the human being's credit, we are one of the laziest species out there. And it's because we desire achieving the most with the least amount of effort, I feel we reached this conclusion, or we came to this conclusion in the ancient sense, I should say. And don't get me wrong, there are small semblances of this that take place in everyday life, you know? I mean, it's easy to brush aside something that happens as, bad luck, or good luck, or I'm just fortunate today. And because you don't really need the immediate operating reality as to why that thing happened. And there are some parts of religion that even go to there as well, where you don't have to take serious stock into why something happened. You can just chalk it up to something else. Your brain is happy because there's a seemingly internally logical conclusion, as long as you don't look too hard. And humans are excellent at not looking too hard if we don't want to.
Or we don't feel the need to.
Or we don't feel the need to because we feel justified in what we know.
Right. So, and in the case of the universe, if we're trying to explain the universe, God is often given as the unmoved mover, as Thomas Aquinas put it. That you know, everything that gets moved is moved by something else. Well, eventually there has to be a first one, otherwise we have infinite regress. So God is the first thing which moved something else, but was not moved himself. Now, there's a problem with this, though, that it's basically, it is just an assertion. But more importantly, the reason why we feel that these things need explanation is because they're complex, but
we're imposing a human trait, though, on the complexity as well with the unmoved mover.
Well, there's that, but also there's the fact that in order to create something complex, the creator must itself be complex, arguably more complex than its creation.
Right.
So doesn't God demand the same class of explanation? That if God is even more complex than the universe, and the reason why the universe needs an explanation is because it's complex, then God also needs an explanation. So where did God come from? And so we could throw a cop-out and say, oh, well, God has a God. Of course, this is sacrilege in Christianity and most other religions.
Or you can take and do what Christianity and most other religions have done and say, well, they just were. And you acknowledge the fact that they're unexplainable things, and you admit to the fact there are things that you cannot understand or that you cannot explain and will never be able to explain, even if you jump to that conclusion a little too quickly. But it's okay to throw things into that ball field, because if it's not possible to be explained, I don't have to put forth the effort to attempt to understand it or to explain it. And so I can just say, well, this is the level of complexity that it's already outside of our understanding, so there is nothing more complex than that. Or it's so unfathomable that it has to be God. So, and only he could ever understand it. So we might as well not even try.
Right. Now, the question then is, why can't we apply this to the universe itself? Right? Why can the universe not just have always existed? Right? Or why can't we seek a genuine explanation? We seem to demand an explanation for the universe, but for some reason not for God. And I think this is a double standard.
I agree. Well, and admittedly, however, it's a double standard that I think, even though it's instituted by those who are religious, is a weakness. By implying the double standard acknowledges a weakness in your thought processes.
Right. Well, because if we say that things that are complex need an explanation, then by positing God as an explanation, we create another infinite regress, which was the first problem with the moving movers.
Right. And to give some credit to those who began pondering these questions, because I think that is one of the only Samir homages the scientific method and those who conduct science can actually pay back towards their religious ancestry, is that the desire to know and the desire to seek to come up with an explanation to these seemingly either infinitely complex or nearly impossible, if not impossible, to understand and explain phenomena. The difference is science continues to try. And that's what it states. And that's why its goal is never complete. So religion got humanity back in its infancy to the point where it began to ponder the questions, but it stopped short of answering them beyond a catch-all, which is God. Because
well, if God is the real explanation, why search for another one?
Mm-hmm.
So, and we acknowledge that this is not a good enough explanation for a lot of things, because science has already explained so many different phenomena that previously would have been reserved to God, but now that we understand them, we can get a lot more done. For instance, medicine.
Right.
Had we stuck with our religious wisdom, the field of medicine would not exist, or it would be a lot stranger and less effective than it is now.
And everyone would be an anti-vaxxer. So.
Right.
Sorry. Not implying that all religious people are anti-vaxxers or anything.
Right. So that's a big problem with that. We have to acknowledge when we really don't know things.
Yeah.
And seek real answers.
And I think that's if you disagreed with everything we've said for the last 3 videos and the beginning of this one, and probably everything that's going to come next, if you wholeheartedly are like, I'm out, I'm not on it, I can't, I don't agree, I think you're wrong. And as most school teachers and those who would try to explain something would say, if you don't take anything else away from this, I would say this is probably the most important thing you can take away is, can you be wrong? Or is it possible that you just don't know. Because that's where it really starts. If a person, and that's why if you look at epistemology, they don't frame it in a binary of do you know or do you don't know. It's always in
why do you think you know?
Why do you think you know? Or why are you, how confident are you? It moves that away. But if you're so sure and you just know and you can't acknowledge that there's a possibility that you're wrong or that you don't know, which I will say we acknowledge that we don't know for sure about certain things. Science never claims to know for sure the answers to things initially, and it acknowledges that there are things that that the people who, well, science can't know anything, but the people who practice scientific methods in their real life, and those who are much braver and much more diligent than us that actually go out and perform the science.
If only we had a shorter name for those people.
Scientists. Oh, that's a whole other thing. But if you you always start off with saying, I don't know, but I want to find out. And I feel like my big issue with Christianity, but religions in general, is saying, I do know, and here's the answer. And you find that often in debates. There's a good clip of a Hitchens debate with, I think it was William Lane Craig. I can't remember. I'm picking on him because he's a very prominent apologist, I guess. If I find it, I'll link it. And it's said that, well, I do know the answer, by Dr. Craig or whomever it was that started, whoever represented the Christianity, saying, well, I do know the answer. I know it beyond a shadow of a doubt. And I don't have to prove that. I just know it. And I'm offering people something that I know is true, whereas you're offering them something that you don't know is true. And it's said in such a way that you would think, people who, scientists would say you're coming from a weakened position, but I think we would argue that coming from and starting at the place where you acknowledge you don't know, or it hasn't been explained, is the place to start, because then it allows you to truly understand, to truly chase without any hindrances what it could be. And we're the same, and that's kind of what this whole channel's been about, and what our philosophy is about, is finding out the truth. And we acknowledged at the very beginning that we don't know what that truth is. We know it's there, we know it's out there, we know the aspects of it exists out there, and we're trying to find it. And we're trying to help find it by maybe even encouraging others to join in our pursuit as well. So.
Yep, I agree. I was going to save this till the end, but the real thesis here is that there's nothing wrong with not knowing something. Mm-hmm. Because that's the place where someone like William Lane Craig comes from when he says, well, I do know, and you come from a place where you don't really know. Well, the thing is, you may not really know, even though you think that you do. And there's nothing wrong with admitting that you don't know. It's just being honest. And that the unknown, the existence of the unknown, is motivation to discover the truth.
Yeah.
That if we think that really all things can be explained by God, why would we seek to learn anything?
Yeah.
Apparently we have all the answers. But also, apparently we don't. Otherwise, we wouldn't keep discovering things.
Right. And I'll be honest with you, if we did know everything, then there's nothing left to be done. And I think that's another part of humanity that this comes from. To give an example or an anecdote, I personally experience the strangest feeling when I complete a book or a movie or a game or some type of narrative. I complete the story to its conclusion. There's the most complicated feeling that's had for me afterwards. And I would be curious to know if anyone else experiences this. Let us know if you do, because I think this is going to be worth speaking about at some point. you experience joy at the resolution, but despair at the same time because it is complete and there's nothing left to be done. And you're left...
Right, because in the case of a book or, any story, there really isn't anything left. You're finished.
You're finished. And and I distinctly remember this. There's a childhood memory, I will say, to finish my anecdote about it, when I completed a Game Boy game. And to me, that was it. There is no more. What are my options? I can just do it again, but it's not the same once you do it again, necessarily. And that's where the despair comes from. It's like, I've devoted all my time to this, and I've reached the end. And I still have time. And I don't want to waste it. So I got to find something else. But you take a brief moment of pause and despair because it's almost as though it died. I liken it to a funeral almost, in a very minor way, because it's despair is that it's ended, it's over. This is all that will ever be. And if the case in Christianity is true, or any religion that claims to have all the answers, that's already done. It's been done. It's over. If you know it all, or if there's an answer out there for everything, or even if there's an entity out there that already knows it all, and not only claims that it knows it all, but that we can't know it all, that it's a pointless venture, it's equally, remorseful. And I even would lean into saying this is why, when you look in the Bible, Revelations is just the stuff that is yet to happen, because you've got to have something left over for there to be done. Whether it ever ends up resolving or not, it's holding that out, because if you don't have a resolution to look forward to, you either spend your entirety in despair because you will never reach your desired outcome, or in despair because there is not an outcome.
So, you're right. But one thing I'll play devil's advocate a little bit to lead into my next thing to segue. Just because something would be disappointing, finding the end of knowledge, that doesn't mean that it isn't the truth, right? That just because something is upsetting doesn't mean it isn't true.
Of course.
Right. So, that being the case, what about the common question, what if you're wrong? Right.
So what if I am?
So, the first thing I'd like to say about this question, what if you're wrong, as directed toward non-believers in Christianity, before we start talking about the real philosophy of it, I'd like to point out that this is, in basically every context in which it's delivered, it's a threat, right? That this is not an argument. What if you're wrong is not an argument, it's a threat. That if you're wrong and I'm right, you'll burn forever, right? You'll be tortured for eternity, and what does that really have to do with anything? It's and this is supposed to be coming from the religion of love and peace, right?
Islam.
Huh? Islam.
I'm sorry. I apologize.
Allegedly, TM. No. So off to the gulag with me.
Off to the archipelago.
Right. So. But you see what I'm saying, that this is just it's a threat that has somehow become polite in our culture. It's a polite way to threaten somebody with the worst thing you can imagine.
Right. Well, it's a threat for your own good. It's like saying, it's assuming the inevitability that it's going to happen and saying, well, I'm doing this for your own good. It's like locking someone in a cage because you don't believe that they can make good decisions for themselves. And so while you're committing an atrocity, you have a moral justification for yourself to know that I know A, what's best for them, even if they don't, and B, I'm doing them a favor and I should feel good about myself for doing it. Now this is admittedly a very mild version of that, but that's how it starts with the threat. And to level a threat is a dangerous thing, because threats with nothing to back them up are pointless. But there's always some ghost of a intention behind the threat. And I'm going to segue it again. It's that mechanism. That's the core of the mechanism that is not unique to Christianity, but to religion, that allows atrocities to occur. The same mechanism that allows the threat of, what if you're wrong, is the same threat used when the suicide bomber is questioning whether or not what he's about to do is the right thing, and his leader or his comrade looks at him and says, but what if you're wrong? It's leveling the same threat to invoke actions that we all would agree are abhorrent.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all derived from the same mechanism that exists within religion, and the belief in a false certainty. So,
right. So, speaking of that, let's talk about the most common codification of this question, which is Pascal's wager. Right. So, for those who don't know this technical term, Pascal's wager is the consideration of there either exists a God or there doesn't. Right. If there exists a God and you believe in the God, then you will spend eternity in paradise. Right. And if you disbelieve, you will spend eternity in torment and suffering. If there doesn't exist a God, then it doesn't matter what you believe. So, based on this, by a matter of probability, you should believe in God, because if you believe, then if God doesn't exist, you're no better off than you were before. And if he does, then you spend an eternity in paradise and you avoid an eternity of punishment.
But those who know anything about game theory know what's going to come next. And I'm going to spoil it if you don't have anything else to say.
Go ahead, I'll let you do it.
This is identical to the very common scenario that is used to explain the game theory to those who usually are new to it. Like if you've not been introduced to game theory before and you go out and you look up what is game theory or game theory for beginners. And we're not talking about like video games or like board game theory. No, game theory is a science dedicated to probability and outcomes when involving humans. It's partially psychological and it's partially mathematic. Mostly psychological. But the prisoner's dilemma, to take the tangent, is there are two prisoners that each are offered a deal by the DA. They've both been captured, but the DA can't prove that either of them did it. Now, they're separated, and they're each offered a deal in which if they just take the lesser sentence and rat on the other person, they will spend less time in prison. But if they refuse the deal, they run the risk of either going to prison for double their original sentence. But if they are correct, they will walk free. So what you have is you created 2x2 grid where there are two outcomes that are identical. And in the prisoner's dilemma, it's one rats on the other, or one gives the other up. In this case, is the worst scenario for one and the okayest, the moderate scenario for the other. In the example of what if you're wrong, or Pascal's wager, this is the example of, well, God either exists and you don't believe, so one of you goes, that's the outcome, or he doesn't exist and you don't believe. They're both wasted. Sorry, if he doesn't exist but you do believe, they're just both wastes. They're both moderate outcome. The moderate outcome for both participants in the example of the prisoner's dilemma is they both rat on each other. And this is the safe state, or it's not the optimal state, but it's the state, the neutral state. I forget the technical term, but it's the state that's most likely to occur. And it's the state in which the least amount of mutual harm based on the probabilities occurs, where some harm, where neither of you get what you want, but you both avoid the ultimate wrong, right? And so in the prisoner's dilemma, they both rat each other out, and they both get the middle sentence. In this dilemma, In Pascal's wager, it's you believe in God and he doesn't exist, and oh well, at least you're right, or you believe in God, yeah. And then the prime example, which is yet to been stated, is what if both prisoners just don't rat on each other? They both walk free. That's the optimal state. However, it is the least likely state to occur. And that is because there is a huge amount of trust involved in the human case of game theory. But in the example we're talking about, when the threat is removed, this isn't a problem, but if both groups of people, and in the example David in Pascal's wager, it's God doesn't exist and you don't believe, then you're right, and you're true, and you're free. And I'll let you finish, but that's how it compares to the prisoner's dilemma.
So that's actually not where I was going to go with this at all,
Really?
but that was interesting.
Sure.
I was going to take it the route of that Pascal's wager is based upon a false dichotomy. Because it comes with the assumption that the God which either exists or doesn't is the Christian God. There are so many religions that have come and gone or are still around and have notions of paradise and punishment. To quote or paraphrase Sam Harris, based on the number of gods which have been said to have existed, we should all be expecting to go to hell purely as a matter of probability.
If you give everyone a fair chance of, well, let's give them the benefit of the doubt.
If we assume that one out of these gods exists, what are the chances that you're right? If we're talking about this purely in terms of probability, right? So the fact is, it's not a 2x2 grid. It's dozens or hundreds or maybe thousands by thousands wide.
I guess the example I gave at the game theory of the 2x2 grid is the religion or the religion or...
Right.
It just could still, I guess, be formed into a false dichotomy because there's also the apathetic response, but...
Right.
Anyway. That wasn't interesting. No, I didn't know that's I thought for sure that's where you were going with it.
No.
Because it was when you layered it out, it sounded exactly like you were setting up a game theory matrix, and I was like, oh, well, I know the answer to this.
No. But that's the real problem with it. That what about other gods? That's something that Christians, or at least in my experience, Christians really don't like considering, because it's just assumed either they're right or none of the religions are right. Like theirs is the only religion that could be right, and that the others don't even stand a chance, even though they're all based on the same premises, basically.
Right. And it's interesting because this is both. I'm going to take the opposite side of the atheist in this case, because that's the true odd group out, or the agnostic, or the whoever's.
Sure. The non-believer.
The non-religious, yes.
The irreligious.
Irreligious. Areligious. Whatever.
Irreligious is the word.
Irreligious, then, yes. There's a dual... it's a double-edged sword being in this camp, because on the one edge, you are allying every religious group against yourself. But on the other edge, and this is to its credit, you're the one that has the truly unique, air quotes, belief in the fact that you just choose to opt out. So, I forget who said it. I think it may have even been Bill Maher who brought this up when he was talking about atheism. He said the atheism's biggest problem is also its greatest strength, and it's to deal with, the fact that if there was only one other religion, if there was only one religion out there, that religion would have no problem standing up against atheism at all. The fact that they're so fractured is what makes atheism able to exist and stand out. So, to Christians, you can thank Muslims and every other religion, Buddhists, Hindus, all this, you can thank them for the legitimacy that atheism is afforded, and the same to every other religion. So long as there is division amongst you all, then atheism can be allowed to exist in its way, and practically speaking, as it does. I mean, I would argue it would still exist, but
Right, there would definitely still be people who doubted.
Right, but the fact that so many other religions exist lends legitimacy because there is only one type of atheism. Because it's not really, and that's. I'm sorry that I'm continuing down the tangent, but I got to get to this one other point: is when people falsely equivocate atheism as a religion, they say, "Well, yeah, you're still religious. Your religion is atheism." They're missing the point entirely. No, the fact is that you step out of that false dichotomy because you move up to that meta level where it's like, no, it's not that I'm a Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, Jew, any of that thing, in any of those religions. It's that I reject them all because they all follow a similar premise and core mechanical structure, for functioning. I choose to reject that core premise. And so, to those who would say, well, atheism is just a religion, it's just a religion of non-belief, that's an entirely paradoxical and contradictory statement. And I also really don't appreciate hearing it. Regardless of which side of the aisle I would fall on, I think anybody would realize how ridiculous that argument is. Just wanted to bring it up because
Sure.
We haven't addressed it yet.
Yeah, you're right. So that's the problem with Pascal's wager. It's a false dichotomy and fails to take into consideration reality. So the next thing that is often brought up, this is of course particularly to atheists, is you can't disprove God.
We've somewhat addressed this.
A little bit. So, well, and you also just addressed it a little bit, which is that this assumes that atheism is the assertion that no gods exist.
Right, and you'll hear
the case.
Right, and you'll hear it all the time. Well, an agnostic is the splitting hairs that occurs in religious sects gets applied to atheism as the splitting hairs of what kind of atheist are you?
Right.
When in reality, that's a false equivocation as well.
Right. So, and to provide some closure to those who haven't necessarily, or maybe not have considered this before, because of the nature of the burden of proof, atheism is not an assertion that there are no gods, but merely a rejection of claims that there are any.
And especially a rejection in the certainty that there is a God.
Right. And so, and to give a little bit more here, because this is something I hear from a lot of religious people that gets under my skin a little bit. And you just mentioned the splitting hairs between atheism and agnosticism. These are not mutually exclusive. So, time for a little education time with Fauxlosophers here.
We need like a intro song for that. Education time.
So, atheism versus theism has to do with whether or not you believe that any gods exist. Believe that any gods exist, not whether you're certain that any gods exist. Agnosticism versus Gnosticism has to do with whether you claim to know whether your conclusion about these things is true.
Right.
So,
there's another 2x2 matrix that exists. Like in the scenario you set up, there's such thing as an agnostic theist and a Gnostic theist.
Correct.
Just
now,
like there's...
But the thing is that most Christians, especially Christian fundamentalists, are Gnostic theists. That is to say, they believe in a God and they claim to know that their belief is true. That they don't consider that this can be applied to atheism. That the question of no, like if you say you're an atheist, you must claim to know that your conclusion is true.
Which you can't. You can fault them, but I can understand where the jump comes from. Being a Gnostic theist, well, if you've reached a person who's an atheist, you're going to infer your own Gnosticism to them and saying, well, then you must know if you're claiming that I don't know.
Right. So, and of course, there exist agnostic Christians who, believe everything that it says in the Bible, and live their lives as though it's true, but don't claim to actually know that it's true. And so, likewise, there are agnostic atheists, people who don't believe in any gods, but don't claim to know that there are no gods. And there are Gnostic atheists, also called strong atheists, who don't believe in any gods and claim to know that there are none. There's problems with that, but that's not what this series is about, so we'll avoid that.
Yeah, we'll do a whole other thing about Gnosticism, I guess.
Sure. But so now that we're finished with that, so you can't disprove God. Well, as we talked about in the first entry in this series, that doesn't matter. The burden of proof doesn't fall on non-believers to disprove God. But also, maybe we can disprove God. Because, go ahead.
I would qualify before we move on to say, I would say that the burden of proof does not fall to the agnostic in this case.
True, yes. The burden of proof does not fall to the agnostic because they're not making a claim.
Yes. If you were a Gnostic atheist,
you do have a claim to defend.
Then the burden of proof falls to you to prove your claim as well.
So, now the other thing is that atheism in general refers to belief in any God, but you can be atheistic with respect to a particular God. So, for instance, as has been said before by, I believe, Richard Dawkins, a Christian is atheistic with respect to every other God proposed, except for the Christian God. So, you can be atheistic in particular, and you can also be agnostic or agnostic in particular to a particular God. So, when we consider a generic God, normally when we're thinking, on the really, really abstract level about does a God exist, people don't realize it normally, but they're talking about a deistic God. A God which basically has no other properties except maybe being the creator of the universe and being invisible, maybe being everywhere, things like that, but the things that can totally not be measured. We're talking about the most abstract God that can ever be, that most religious people, especially monotheists, can all get on board with, that say, okay, God has all of these properties, and then they disagree on the nitty-gritty details. And so even if you were to prove that a God existed, you have all your work ahead of you to prove that your particular God exists.
It's a two-step process.
Right. So, but likewise, although I don't know of any way to disprove the existence of a generic God, the deistic God, when we start talking about specific gods, now their properties start to matter. That, anyone who can think logically will agree that something that has a contradiction in its definition can't exist, because it's just an incoherent concept. We have to, even if a thing a lot like it exists, we have to fix the definition to be coherent, otherwise we don't even know what we're talking about. We literally don't know what we're talking about. And so when it comes to specific gods, if a contradiction can be found in its definition, we can say conclusively it doesn't exist. Now, let's consider the Christian God. Now, I was planning to go into specifics about this, but I decided not to for personal reasons. Namely that's not really the point. The point of this show is to get people to think about things, and so I don't want to hand conclusions to people. So I decided not to go into specifics, but let's consider at least one property. Well, let's consider the specific God. Let's not even say the Christian God. Let's say the biblical God, because this is highly specific. That there are words written that, although they have been translated and altered over time, they basically can't be argued with. Like you can't dispute what the Bible says about God when we're talking about the biblical God. If we find something that the Bible says about it, then that is the case about it.
So I guess to further go ahead and drill down, when you say biblical God, I'm assuming we're taking like the Protestant canon of what is considered canonical?
Well,
does it not need to be restricted that far?
I don't think that it does need to be restricted any more than that.
And that's fine. So whichever text that we end up citing, if that text is a fundamental part of what you would consider the biblical canon,
right,
then it applies. And if for some reason you're like, oh, well, I believe in all of the biblical God, but that one book doesn't apply to me, then, well.
I think this can go back far enough even to apply to the Judaic God, actually. So, God can do anything, right?
So are we talking about omnipotence?
Well, right, but specifically biblical omnipotence.
Sure.
So, because I didn't want to go into specifics, I neglected to get references to verses which say this. But basically, every Christian can agree that the Bible says God can do all things, everything. It says it in the Old Testament and the New Testament. So, can God sin? According to Christian doctrine, God cannot even be in the same place as sin.
He is the antithesis.
Right. In specifics, there are places where it talks about how God cannot tell a lie, which is a sin according to the Ten Commandments. Presuming that breaking any of the commandments is a sin. I'm taking that as the definition of sin, doing something against what God commands. So, if he can do all things, but he can't sin, then he can't do all things. This is staying strictly within the Bible, not even to mention things like the paradox of the stone or things like that.
Yeah. I would like to play devil's advocate and offer up a point, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
So I would argue from the devil's advocate position that just the statement that God cannot sin and that the statements that God can do anything and God cannot sin are not mutually exclusive.
Okay, why?
Because by doing it, God himself cannot sin. So anything he does is not a sin. So anything that would be a sin that he would then do is no longer a sin. Therefore, then you have to draw the other conclusions from that.
Okay, so let's go into specifics then.
Sure.
So, specifically, God cannot tell a lie.
Okay.
So if we were to take this in the sense in which you just described it, that means that if God says something that wasn't true, it becomes true because he said it,
Yes.
right? So, okay. So suppose God declares something which contains a contradiction.
Right.
Right.
But again, from the devil's advocate position, assuming in this, whether this is a good argument or not, this is the one that I've heard and will use here. It will no longer be a contradiction because he supersedes reality. Ergo.
Right. So basically,
but you're using his omnipotence as an excuse for his omnipotence, like.
Basically, this appears to be special pleading, and a sort of religious elitism, which basically says, well, yeah, you're right, that totally violates logic, but I have access to a logic that is beyond yours, that you apparently can't comprehend, and so you have to take my word for it.
Exactly. Well, the thing is, they wouldn't say that they had access to the logic.
No, they would never say that.
But they might say, though, that, well, God has access to the higher logic that would contradict yours. But since his is a higher logic, I'm going to listen to his higher logic, even though I can't understand it. But,
right.
But even then, at that point, they've admitted that they cannot understand it and that they argue from ignorance.
Well, right. Or, well, that it's logically incoherent.
Yes, well, and then they appeal to the authority.
They appeal to authority and say, well, but your logic is inferior, which is to totally deny the way that logic works in the first place.
Right, which is why anyone who would argue from that position, once you reach that point, discourse can no longer yield an efficient result.
Right.
As long as pure logic is concerned. Like, logic at that point, you cannot use it in the argument because the other person will not recognize it.
Right. So returning to the main channel now, that if we say God can do everything, but he also can't do everything, we have a contradiction in the definition. And I'll leave it to the listeners to decide what that necessarily means. But the point here was to say that although a generic deistic God apparently can't be disproven, that doesn't mean that specific ones can't. This is a red herring to point to a God that you're not really defending. as a defense for your specific God that you're supposed to be defending. So the other thing that we've sort of already mentioned is the existence of other gods. That, okay, even if we grant we can't disprove the Christian God, you can't disprove the Islamic God or any of the Hindu gods or goddesses, etc., etc., etc. This, of course, is just the core problem with an argument from ignorance or with faith, that you can conclude basically anything with it. Go ahead.
Well, no, I was agreeing with you, but I was also going to make a point to something that is often said of atheism, that it is pessimistic. People who believe in a religion, especially Christians, like to believe they hold the monopoly on optimism, and they will even use their optimism as a reason why they believe it, because it's also happy and such according to their doctrine or whatever from the light reading. But that being said, in the situation you've outlined, where say we are forced into a scenario in which you say we cannot prove your God doesn't exist, now you have to go and disprove every other God. I'm just paraphrasing. That is, to my mind, the most pessimistic, is that there is no good choice and there is no way to know the right answer that way. And none of them offer it, and they all use the same method like you were going into to yield the same answer, ergo they all by definition are pessimistic. Because I would argue that it is pessimistic to take something as a belief based.
Well, right, it's pessimistic and defeatist to say, well, we can't know, so you just have to pick.
Yes, but that is what would be required,
right,
in the scenario in which you laid out. And so I wanted to make the point to that atheism isn't exactly as pessimistic as it's given a credit for. It's actually quite optimistic when in that framing.
So with that in mind, I'd like to move on to another question that that gives people pause. That is not in the notes, so we're about to have some fun.
Oh.
What do you have to lose by being religious?
Okay.
Right. That it under the assumption that it's sort of related to Pascal's wager, really, that if God does exist and you don't believe, then you have punishment waiting for you, and if you do believe, you have reward waiting for you. But if God doesn't exist, have you really lost anything by believing? Right? Isn't it still worth your time to just go ahead and act like it's real?
Right. And this is what I was kind of getting at, is the optimal state in this game theory we've laid out is actually God doesn't exist and you don't believe. You don't believe he exists and he doesn't exist. It's truly coherent and everything is in alignment.
Right. Well, I guess where I wanted to go with it is that there are lots of, like, okay, let's take as an assumption that the Christian God doesn't exist, and you do believe that he exists. So what do you lose? Well, by most people's practice, there are many rules put forth for you which you need to follow, which have the potential to, and often do, destroy relationships. For instance, the prohibition on homosexuality. How many relationships, especially inside of families, have been totally destroyed by this belief? Where people who would otherwise have been a perfectly acceptable member of a family have been utterly rejected and disowned by their families because they believed in Christianity, or any other lifestyle like this, which is disapproved of by Christians, where there is no rational reason to, I'll put it this way, hate these people. And Christians will balk at this and say, no, I don't hate them. I hate their sin.
Yeah, I actually love them because I want them to be different.
Right, but you don't really love them if you don't want them to be themselves. And this really is the problem, that you miss out on so much of the human experience, what is really great about being alive, by subjecting yourself to these rules.
Well, and I was going to say two other things. I've been waiting this entire series to bring one of these up, but the other one I just thought of. The other one, the first one is, I would argue that by following and subjecting yourself to these things, you limit what it means to be human. And I'm going to pick on the fundamental characteristics of humanity that is our exploration and our enduring, and the curiosity of the human, condition, I guess is what I could say. This is anecdotal, but I'm going to use it as a example, not as evidence, but as an example. There is evidence out there for this, but I have yet to have the source. I will link it if I find it. There were more than just Homo sapiens. Is it sapiens sapiens?
Yeah, Homo sapiens sapiens, I think, is the very technical one, but we've abbreviated it since then.
Right.
Because there was a Homo sapiens, which was not us.
It was a common ancestor between us and, yeah. But the thing is, there were other humans at one point in history. They have all ceased to exist. And one thing that defined us from them was that we were found in places far beyond where we were the least domestic. There's something in the human condition that calls us to be curious, and not only to be curious, but to act on our curiosity in ways that are even dangerous to us. And what makes that different than other living beings, because, for instance, you hear the phrase "curiosity killed the cat." People would joke and personify a cat as being curious because they will approach something that we know is dangerous, and then they will mess with it and then hurt themselves. Now, we are impressing upon them something that we know is dangerous, but that speaks a lot about what we do. We did things that we know are dangerous. We do things that we know are dangerous. Going to the moon is the most dangerous thing that humanity has ever done on the individual scale.
Or even on a more mundane level. How many people had to die to figure out which mushrooms were okay to eat?
Right. But the thing is...
And we now enjoy the fruits of their deaths,
Right. But we do things, and this is what makes it different than the cat. The cat doesn't know that something's dangerous. We know something is dangerous, but we do it anyway. And you don't have to coax us. You don't have to force people. They will willingly submit themselves to dangerous things for the sake of the possibility that there's a better outcome.
Well, it's why we take, the trope of laughing in the face of danger as heroic rather than stupid.
Right. And I'm going to move to the second thing from that I've been waiting to say this whole time. And it's an homage, but freedom as well. To submit yourself to rules that are not your own, that have been issued by someone else, that you blindly agree with because you just do, and which is what it means to be fundamentalist, and accept that it is the truth without any evidence, is to put yourself into bondage to that ideology. And that's what an ideologue is a person that submits their own freedom willingly to be a slave to an ideology. And I argue that the most important and fundamental principle on which human beings can take as a virtue is freedom. And that's something that you say that in America, and everyone is like, you say the freedom part in America, and everyone is ecstatic, and they agree, and it's true. I assert that it's true, that, and even if I can't necessarily prove it, I would argue that there's that for it, and that we have to find the truth for it. But freedom is important, and true freedom isn't being allowed to do something. I have once had it described to me that under the fundamentalist Christian doctrine, humans are free, and they cite the ideal of free will, but only free to do the right thing. And that's abhorrent to me. If you are given the, air quotes, freedom to only do the right thing, you're not free. You are a self-delusional prisoner and slave. And it's often been likened to North Korea by a very prominent speaker. But the one benefit is that in North Korea, you can at least die. Christianity holds over you and restricts and removes your freedom not only in this life, but in the life it claims to exist after this one, if you don't do what is right. That is not free. Letting someone or something else impose upon you restrictions on your life and tells you what to do and how to live and enforces it through punishment aggressively, through forces worse apparently than death. If you subject yourself to that willingly, if it doesn't exist, then you are giving up far more, in my opinion, than the person who chooses to not believe in the case that God exists. That's my assertion. And I know that there are probably many people out there who might disagree or have an argument with that, but I'm offering an example of something you give up. You give up the freedom to truly chase and go out, explore, be curious. And this is just on the individual level. On the species-wide level, we give up the ability to adapt to the ever-changing universe by strapping ourselves to the ticking time bomb that is a rigid rule set that exists just because, and it exists and isn't founded on anything physical. It isn't founded on any law of the universe or anything else. It's tied to just an idea. And we strap ourselves to that idea, and strapping yourself to an idea like that only leaves you tied up on a beach before the tide rises. That's all it means to me. So that's, in my opinion, what you have to lose. And a lot of that is metaphorical, but you can take that same concept and apply it to many different things in your life. The person who determined, you look at the people who have defied in the face of the religious doctrine and ideologues before, and have made great discoveries. You take Copernicus, Galileo, were all persecuted. I forget his name, the guy who discovered genes, or the concept of genes. He was actually he was a religious official. He was a priest of some sort of thing.
Mendel.
Mendel, yeah. He suffered for discovering that, because it didn't conform to the doctrine of his time and the ideology. And I know, and the religious fundamentalists will say, well, and the only thing you can say to that would even make the ideology even remotely tenable to this is that, well, it's changed over time. Like, for instance, a lot of Christians are dropping their biases towards homosexuality. But if you can just change it at your whim, then what good is it? And so the one thing the fundamentalists have that is at least logically coherent as far as their own logic is concerned is the fact that, well, it's forever eternal and doesn't change. Well, rules and laws that are forever eternal and do not change will strap humanity to a ticking time bomb, because the universe doesn't wait for us. Nature doesn't wait for us to, pick the right doctrine or to, get it right. You have to keep up with it, and that's my estimation. And that's one thing that, science offers you, is the ability to not only be completely aware of the world around you and the universe around you, but to actually build your belief system off of that very changing universe and trying to figure out its trajectory so that you can change with it in a way that benefits not just yourself, but others. And to recuse yourself from all of that on the simply ideological doctrine and just belief by I said so and your own authority is not only damaging to you as the individual, but it is also potentially hurting and damaging those around you and anyone that you spread that to. I would make that claim as well. So it's not only are you missing out, it's harmful. I would go so far to say it's even harmful, not just to yourself, but to others, and borderline immoral. But I'm not prepared to make that case today, because that's a whole other thing. But that's what I had to say about it.
I think that's a good place to leave it off.
Right in the middle of a rant for me.
Yes. So we can discuss this after we finish if we want to actually do this, and if we decide not to, then I'll cut it out. But I'd like to do something special to finish off the series, and it has to do with a lot of what you've just ranted about. A song actually that
Really?
That we would be able to freely use as a part of this. It's called Golden Sunrise by an artist named Josh Woodward. I think it's highly appropriate. It would be a special way to end this short series.
You know what? It's the end of the year. I'm glad we made it through. I don't see any reason why we can't celebrate in song.
All right.
And I hope that you all listening will celebrate along with us if you're not too perturbed by what I've had or David has had to say. And if you continue to disagree with us in any remote fashion, but you're still here at the end of this video, I will say you have at the very least earned respect, because it takes a lot to be in the face of something you disagree with and still hear them out till the end of it. And that is the first step, I think, into what's really going to help. That's the first step to actual discourse. To civil discourse is knowing and hearing out what someone you disagree with has to say and trying to understand it. I appreciate that. I'm sure David does too.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not about to speak for you until I'm prepared to. No, but with that all being said, happy holidays, Merry Christmas,
etc.
etc., etc. And we hope you all had a good year, and we will see you all next year for that lame joke. Get that out of there. Yeah. One little more state of the podcast address thing to take care of before we get into the happy jolly time, if David hasn't already cut it in, is we are taking a break, folks. Turns out we're people. We're not just voices coming through speakers. That'd be interesting. But we want a break, and we're really excited that we've gotten this far this year, and we will not be posting a full-length podcast for the first week of January. We will be back on the second week of January, whatever that date is. I guess if I were somewhat prepared, that I would have already known instead of looking it up right now.
The 11th.
Yes, we will be posting again on the 11th, and that will likely either begin or end with our intentions for the new year. I don't know about David, but I don't believe in New Year's resolutions, and I don't keep them. But I do believe in themes and setting goals. And one thing he and I are going to do over our little break is set out some new goals for us going to the new year. This officially ends our beta period and trying this out with our 12th episode, I believe.
Yes.
Oh, 12 episodes, 12 days of Christmas. Wow, there's all kinds of coincidences that are going on here that are totally coincidences. No sarcasm, seriously. Coincidence. But we're going to set up a few goals, and one of the other things that I think we both agree on is being transparent to a degree with our users, with our listeners, about what we're intending to do, so you can decide with the most information we can provide whether or not you want to continue to subscribe to us and chime in every week. And so that all being said, we really look forward to that, and we really appreciate all of you that have stuck around and all of those who have participated throughout the year 2018, and we hope and wish you the well going into 2019. Anything you'd like to add, David?
Nope.
All right, I will hold my seat as the Fauxlosophers windbag and go from there. So.
Sheltered from the sunlight in the shade beneath the tree. We hide behind the shadows like an orphaned refugee. The apple tree of knowledge shed its fruit along the way. The injury is fading, but the hunger is here to stay until the day when there's no memory of what we used to be. Golden taught to follow blindly like there's nothing here to see. A slave to some philosophy will somehow make you free, and you will be so gladly handcuffed and lightened from above. Golden sunrise on your eyes, fill your dark skies, made you blind. Oh, with ignorance a virtue, the question is a sin. Is there no remedy for the state that we are in? With knowledge on a leash, it's like a terminal disease, and we won't be awake to see that we are fading out. Golden sunrise on your eyes, fill your dark skies, made you blind. Another day in darkness for the ones who've seen the light. Broken eyes are shining in the stillness of the night. They never see the beauty of the world as it is. Made you blind. Oh.
Well, the last one of the year, Philosophers.
Fauxlosophers.